Reading for I Met You in a Story, Bob Jones University Press, 2nd edition. Showdown by Tim Davis, illustrated by Tim Davis and Noel Snyder.
Dust River Gulch. Now don't get the notion that the folks in Dust River Gulch were a bunch of softies. Nothing could be further from the truth. Dust River Gulch was inhabited by some of the wildest characters west of the Mississippi. Few human-type outlaws would test a town whose sheriff was a thoroughbred Mustang. But this here Gruffalo Buffalo now, there was a different sort of outlaw. He was wanted in 78 countries and half a dozen zoos. It was no wonder the folks of Dust River Gulch were feeling a mite queasy when they heard he'd been passing through. It wasn't that folks didn't have confidence in Sheriff J.D. Saddlesoap. No doubt about it, he was an awe-inspiring figure, a mighty good lawman, and a fine-looking horse to boot. Many's the wild and woolly outlaws he'd driven out of town. But you see, this was different. This was Gruffalo Buffalo. Well, seems as if it was old Tumbleweeds McPherson that mostly started stirring up the townsfolk. Over at Rosie's restaurant, he was a-gobbling down some grub when he leaked out the rumor. Yep, about this time tomorrow, I reckon most folks will be sitting in their houses with the doors bolted up. Old Bo, the lizard, leaned over from the next table. "What you talking about, Louise?" "Nothing other than Gruffalo Buffalo and his gang of bum steers," replied old Tumbleweeds with a snort. "Gruffalo Buffalo?" Old Bo got so startled that he dropped the spoon. Kerclunk! Well, the murmuring started mighty quick, like all through the restaurant. For long, every ear in the house was tuned in to old Tumbleweeds. It was the usual way news got around in Dust River Gulch. The old weasel continued. "Yep, word is it had Gruff and his gang are coming to town tomorrow." "Tomorrow," squealed Rosie, who kept the restaurant as tidy as her own kitchen. "Somebody go get J.D." While a wild-eyed prairie dog went a-scampering after Sheriff Saddlesoap, old Tumbleweeds kept on a-stirring up the folk. "I heard the last town old Gruff and his gang passed through, the folks haven't nearly recovered yet." While some folks were trembling and whispering, Bo asked, "Why haven't they?" Well, he and his gang done humiliated the sheriff and his deputies so bad that they hightailed it out of town. So then the folks were just so scared they just did whatever old Gruff asked them. Tumbleweeds paused to munch a spell. "Nearly stole the town blind, they did?" A scrawny buzzard asked. "You think Sheriff J.D. can take 'em on?" Tumbleweeds shrugged. "I don't know. Gruff's ruined plenty of sheriffs in his day." Well, at that comment, the muttering and a murmuring got near a deafening pitch there at Rosie's restaurant. Some folks were saying they'd been a-planning to be out of town the next day anyway. And the rest started making such like plans. Miss Rosie, she wouldn't have none of it. She started a-scolding and a-shaming those folks for not trusting in Sheriff J.D. like they should have. Of course, everybody knew she had a sweet spot in her heart for J.D., but they took the scolding to heart anyways. The little lady kept on a-going. "Why, he's the finest, bravest sheriff you'll ever find in any country, any place. No outlaw's going to run him out of this town. No, not J.D. Then the doors swung open. In walked none other than Sheriff J.D. Saddlesoap himself. "Why, thank you, Miss Rosie. That's mighty sweet of ya." Miss Rosie turned sort of pink like as J.D. smiled over at her. "Well, it's true, isn't it, J.D.?" she said. "You're going to stand up to that there Gruffalo Buffalo and his gang, aren't you?" J.D.'s smile looked a mite strained, and he swallowed mighty hard. but he said he would. If nothing else, he wouldn't make Miss Rosie into a liar. Well, tomorrow came a mite sooner than Sheriff J.D. was a-hopin'. Seemed like most folks decided to stay in town after all, seeing as how Sheriff J.D. was a-going to stand up to Gruff and his gang. They weren't about to miss that, now were they? Round about noontime, old Tumbleweeds was out in the street with his ear to the ground. Lots of folks was a-watchin' real quiet-like. Pretty soon he spoke up. "They's a-comin'. I kin hear the rumble." Everybody cleared the street and waited. They was a-lookin' out winders and peerin' round barrels. Rosie's restaurant was jammed with folks, eatin' and strainin' their necks to see round each other outside. No doubt about it, that cloud of dust on the horizon was gettin' closer every second. J.D. was a-waitin'. He wouldn't start no trouble, but as sure as he had promised Miss Rosie, he wouldn't stand for none either. So into Dust River Gulch they came, old Gruffalo Buffalo and his gang of bumsteers. They did a little hootin' and hollerin', and then they headed to Rosie's. Everybody was actin' as calm as they could inside, but most folks were sweatin' like it was 200 degrees. Then in sauntered Gruff and his steers. "We's hot," rumbled the big mangy buffalo. He turned to Rosie, standing behind the stove. "You there, give my boys some milkshakes." Rosie went right to it and served those 5 bumsteers real quick-like. They started a-slurpin' and a-sloppin' it like no-count critters they were. Meanwhile, old Gruff, he was a-sauntering around the place like he was a king. He plucked the cherry right off the top of one buzzard's sundae. Gruff smiled and rubbed his straggly-looking beard while he ate that cherry. The buzzard didn't say nothin'. Fact is, the only sound in the place was the slurping and the slopping of those bumsteers, starting on their second round of milkshakes. Finally, Gruff seemed about strutted out, and he found a table to his liking. So old Gruff, he took a seat. Poor old Bo, the lizard, he was already a-sittin' at that same table. Gruff sort of gave him the eye and rumbled. "I prefers a private table myself." And Bo, he near melted to the floor and slithered over to the next table while Gruff chuckled to himself. "Hey, gal," Gruff yelled out real sudden-like. "I's ready to order." So Rosie, she hustled on over to his table. "Give me a gallon of the sourest, smelliest, most curdled up milk you got," growled the shaggy outlaw. There was some quiet like ooh and an eye at that, and Gruff sat back in his chair with a satisfied snort. Then Rosie said, "Only 1 gallon, sir?" in a smart alecky sort of way. Gruff, he raised himself up and rumbled out, "Nah, make it 3 gallons, gal, and quick like." Pretty soon Rosie came back with the sourest milk you ever smelled. Gruffles sort of chuckled and drank it all down like it was nothing to him. Of course, everybody at Rosie's couldn't hardly believe it. The old buffalo let out with a hiccup and yelled over to his gang of bumsteers, still a-slurpin' and a-sloppin', "Come on, boys, we's a-goin'." So the whole bunch of them started for the door. Most of the folks started breathing normal-like again. That is, till Miss Rosie spoke up. She said, "Sir, you and your boys haven't paid your bill." Then old Gruff turned around real slow-like and looked Rosie in the eye. And it got quiet, terrible quiet. Then the bumsteers started a-laughing and a-snorting like nobody's business, and out of the door they went. And Gruffly started sauntering out too, and Rosie, she was a mighty plucky lady, said flat out, "Sir, you haven't paid." The bumsteers couldn't hardly take it. They were laughing so hard, old Gruff strutted over to the poor old Beau and picked him up by the kerchief and set him on the table by Rosie. He blew out some sour milk fresh and said, "My friend here says he'll pay," and the bumsteers started a-howling with laughter. The laughing didn't last long this time, because who do you think came through the swinging doors? None other than Sheriff J.D. Saddlesoap. Gruffle smiled and said, "Well, if it ain't the sheriff." J.D. just looked at Rosie and asked, "What's the trouble here, Miss Rosie?" Rosie told him, while Gruffle sort of snickered and rubbed his mangy beard. The bumsteer was getting mighty interested in the going-ons. Sauntered back into Rosie's. One of the mangiest of them spoke up. "What you gonna do about it, Sheriff?" J.D. puffed up his chest and replied, "Gruffle, you ain't getting away with nothing in Dust River Gulch. Pay up and get out of town." Gruff sauntered over till he was most in J.D.'s face and breathed out sour milk breath. "Who's gonna make me, Sheriff?" "You're looking at him." "Well, Gruff," he started smiling and rubbing that mangy beard of his. "Maybe we can make a deal with this here sheriff, eh, boys?" The bums snorted and snickered. "Yeah, boss, maybe. You boys want a little entertainment?" "Yeah, boss." Gruffle smiled real mean-like and said, "How about we have ourselves a little rodeo, Sheriff? Just you and me." "What are you saying, Gruff?" asked the sheriff, and the steers commenced their laughing again. "We'll have a rodeo. You ride me and I ride you. And the one who stays on the longest is the winner. See?" Well, now, that mangy buffalo must have had nearly 1,000 pounds on J.D., but one glance in Miss Rosie's direction and the sheriff figured he'd accept the challenge. "If I win, you'll pay up and get out of town, right?" Gruffle snorted his approval. "Gladly, Sheriff. But now, if you might just happen to lose, you'll do the same." J.D. nodded. "That is, if you can still walk." At that, the bumsteers started a snickering and a snorting like nobody's business again. "Let's go, Sheriff," grunted Gruff. So out went the outlaw and the lawman, followed real close, like by the snickering steers. And then most the whole town gathered round in front of Rosie's restaurant. Gruffle and J.D., they stood on opposite sides of the street, a-loosening up and eyeing each other real fearsome-like. They decided old Tumbleweeds would keep time, along with one of the smarter bum steers, or at least the one of the less dumb ones, that is. J.D. would ride Gruffle first, then vice versa. Gruffle, he had a sneaky, sly sort of smile on his face like he was up to something, and you wouldn't know it. He was. When nobody was a-paying no mind, he slipped one of the spurs in his boot and hid it in his thick, mangy hair on his back, real secret-like. He whispered what he had done to his no-count steers, and they started some fearsome snickering. Meanwhile, J.D. was developing a pretty sizable lump in his throat. He had never ridden no buffalo before, especially not when it counted for so much. Miss Rosie, she must have sensed it, because she ran over to him and planted a big sweet kiss on the end of his nose and said, sweet as anything, "Whoop him, J.D." With a spark in his eye, Sheriff J.D. Saddlesoap called out, "I'm ready, Gruffle. Are you?" Gruffalo Buffalo. He smiled and snorted out, "Yep, and there he stood, ready to be ridden." All the folks held their breath. Then J.D. galloped over and hopped on Gruffle's back. "Start a time and wheeze," called Miss Rosie, and he did. The mangy outlaw started a bucking and a snorting. He ran round in a circle, frontwise and back, sending some folks for cover. He reared up and down. He tramped, while J.D. was bouncing around his back like a jackrabbit. "Ride him, J.D." "Yahoo! Whoop him, Sheriff. Ride him right out of town." Meanwhile, the bumsteers was a snickering a mite less, but Gruff was a snorting up a storm. He was a twisting in contortions and a kicking like a mad billy goat. J.D. was a feeling like a sack of potatoes that's been bounced downstairs, but he was still a-holding on. Then he hit that spur. Yow! The spur sent J.D. up past the roof of Rosie's and down. He landed in a cloud of dust, but one glance in that direction of his favorite gal, and he claimed he was just feeling a mite sore. 1 minute and 42 seconds, announced Tumblewees. Old Bo the lizard was so excited that he yelled, "Beat that, you outlaw, you!" But gruffly he shuffled over to Bo's face and blew out enough sour breath to send old Bo into a coughing fit. Heh heh. Gruffle turned to JD and snorted, "You're next, Sheriff. Now I ride you." So JD, he dusted himself off and stood in position, still a catching his breath. Gruffle reared up and took a flying leap onto JD's back. Whomp! JD was squished flat on his face, like as a bearskin rug. "Start a timing, Weasel," chuckled Gruff, and he did. 30 seconds went by, and the bum steers was all smiles. You see, Sheriff Saddle Soap hadn't got off his face yet. "Come on, JD, buck him, Sheriff, buck him." "Get up, JD, you can get him yet." The bum steers was a-laughing like nobody's business because by now, because JD was still a-squirming underneath the big buffalo. But how was old Gruff a-doing? Seemed like he should have been laughing louder than them all, but he weren't. Nope, instead he was looking kind of greenish. One of the bum steers noticed it. "What's wrong with the boss?" "Dunno, he's looking mighty queasy though." And sure enough he was. His face was a puckering and a twitching. Seems like 3 gallons of sour milk had gotten mighty churned up. He was a groaning and a moaning and a holding his stomach. Then he let right out with a hiccup and rolled right off JD's back, howling like a shot coyote. Folks' mouths dropped open. They was so shook up they couldn't hardly say nothing. Sudden-like, over the moaning of the sickly buffalo, old Tumbleweed spoke up and said, 1 minute and 29 seconds. Then what a ruckus there were. All kinds of cheering and yelling. "You did it, JD. You won. Way to whup him, Sheriff." JD, he stood himself up and brushed off the dust. Folks was a-jumping around him and shaking his hoof, congratulating him like he was a living legend or something. Seeing as how they licked fair and square, the bum steers sort of sneaking out of town with their moaning boss slung over their shoulders. "Hey, boys," yelled out Rosie, "you haven't paid." "Ain't paid," shouted some old prairie dog. "Why, we ought to tar and feather 'em." "That's too good for 'em," yelled Bo. "We'll let JD take 'em on." "Yeah, but let me get a piece of 'em first," hollered some burly mountain goat. The bum steers emptied out their pockets as quick as a flash and started running like fresh branded cattle clear out of Dust River Gulch. And the cheering and the celebrating commenced all over again. The folks carried JD into the restaurants. Most everybody wanted to buy him a sundae or a shake or such like thing. "Don't spoil his appetite now," said Rosie, "'cause I'm going to cook him the best tasting supper he ever laid eyes on." Kind of glanced shy-like over at JD. "That is, if he'll accept my invitation to supper." "Miss Rosie," replied the sheriff, "I wouldn't miss it for nothing." Well, nowadays, while they're slurping down their milkshakes at Rosie's restaurant, folks still listen to old Tumbleweeds tell about the time old Gruffle Buffalo and his gang of bum steers came to town. And Rosie, she keeps plenty of sour milk on hand, just in case.